I'm very happy to welcome Lisa Jackson, who's joining us from Toronto. Let me introduce you very briefly. Lisa is a prolific and award-winning Anishinaabe filmmaker based in Toronto, but I think for a certain time you were based in Vancouver as well. Her projects have a very broad range. I think you're coming from documentary film, but over the years you were also working on music videos, experimental short films, and I think most recently you also started with VR projects. I'm very curious to learn more about that. All her projects, or most of your projects, are based in or addressing indigenous on very different levels. Your film have been broadcasted widely in Canada on Canadian TV, but also we're screening on festivals all over the world: Toronto's Hot Dogs, Edinburgh International Film Festival, Tribeca in New York, Sundance Film Festival, and in Germany, of course, Berlinale, Berlin International Film Festival. Maybe I just briefly start what brought us together. A very important contribution, a film that I think now is like 8 years. You made it 8 years ago. It's called How a People Live, and we are screening these films once our exhibition will be open. We will screen this important documentary as part of our Magnetic North exhibition. It's not a very obvious or very obvious choice, because this exhibition is on the painting of the Group of Seven, modernistic painting of landscape from 1910 to 1940. But a very important part of the show is a chapter that's called Land versus Landscape, addressing very different notions of how to deal with these different ideas. The landscape stemming in the European background with a long tradition in depicting the landscape. There are people who even say that landscape is from the core an imperialistic how do you say, undertaking. Opposed to that, there's the notion of the land, very important in Canada and very important to the indigenous peoples. But I don't want to say nothing about that, because the title of our talk is Nothing About Us Without Us. So maybe my first question for you, Lisa, is maybe you can tell us a little bit about the notion of the land.
Yeah. Okay.
And its importance in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Martina. Thanks for including the work in the exhibition. I did see the 20-minute tour, and I think it was very interesting, the points that are raised in the exhibition. And land versus landscape. Yeah, oftentimes from an Indigenous perspective, of course, the idea of wilderness, the idea of landscape, all of those things kind of intersect with the romantic notion of, an unpeopled place, right? A virgin area, and that has connotations both for just that kind of joy of connecting to something untouched, seemingly untouched, but also, intersects with, resource development and economic interests always, right? So, I've even heard it said that the sort of renaissance, like after North America was discovered, there was just such an influx of wealth from all the resources taken from North America, starting with the fur trade, timber, on and on. and those things were, of course, taken at the expense of Indigenous livelihoods and lives in many cases. So, you know, it's a really complicated notion. And you know, one of the ways I've seen maybe it boiled down to is this idea that there's perhaps a dichotomy between the idea of land as home and land as resource. And you know, from a colonial perspective, land is often seen as resource. You know, it gets calculated into profits, um, and its own innate value is something really connected to, not to overgeneralize, but Indigenous people, and a more close connection where, you know, culturally most Indigenous nations would put great value on the idea of the human responsibility to perpetuate, honor, respect, work in tandem with the lands. And usually we often will say the lands and the waters, especially when it comes to, I of course lived in Vancouver on the West Coast. So it's the lands and the waters, equally important, the oceans, and that sense of a reciprocal relationship, and even to the point of actual relationship. And it's not a huge part of how a people live, but I would say, you know, there's a section, we're used to seeing totem poles, you know, dances, masks, and these items depict animals, and there's teachings. Yeah, sorry, am I going off? I will just say that.
No, I think maybe not all of our viewers have seen the film, so maybe before diving too much into details, maybe we briefly fill them in what the film is about,
Okay.
or
Yeah.
about the structure of the film.
Okay. Yeah, and
sorry.
So, no. I was just gonna. I'll just finish the last part, and then I'll tell you, which is that it even extends the idea of actual relatives being animals.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the cultural animal representations, depending on the nation, might say, you know, our original treaties were with the animals, or at one point we could talk with the animals, or that we could shapeshift from animal to human. So it's very interconnected. And How People Live is a 1-hour documentary that is about the history of a Kwakwaka'wakw nation, and the specific name of this group is the Kwajalein. And they're on the north end of Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island's a very, very large island off the west coast of Canada in British Columbia. And this very large island on the north end is where the Kwajalein live now. But they didn't always live there. They lived across the strait in a variety of villages nearby. But what happened was in 1964, the government forcibly relocated them to where they are now for sort of administrative purposes, really, to kind of get them closer, more accessible, and easier to sort of manage. And so the film focuses a lot on this 1964 relocation and the impacts on the community, but it actually looks earlier than that, right back to sort of fur trade and the colonization process. And it also looks ahead till now. And I would say it really, there's incredible archival material available for this community because they were so remote. The archive are, there was a lot of visitation by Franz Boas and other anthropologists, and you know, a quite well-known film by Edward Curtis, In the Land of the War Canoes, which used to be called In the Land of the Headhunters, was filmed there. So there's a huge archive, and so the film basically weaves together the stories of community members with this archival material to tell their story of their history through their own words. And it also involves a trip back to their homelands, to these various territories. So there's a sort of interweaving of these historical pieces with a lot of explanation as well of some of the cultural foundations of their culture, their Kwakwaka'wakw culture, including the potlatch and the way that they lived off the land traditionally, and of course still do to some extent.
For us, this film was really crucial for the narration of the whole art of the exhibition, because through this documentary, you really see not only one, but a lot of the effects the Indian Act had on the indigenous peoples. That's something not a lot of people in Germany might know about, as we always have this notion of Canada as the better America. I myself experienced it that way because I knew of the rigid legislative in Australia, and I was aware of the program of bringing indigenous children forcibly into residential schools, and I was really shocked when I was in Canada speaking to different Canadians, and they said, well, the Australians learned from us. Yeah, that was for me really crucial in this film, and very moving to see, especially the interviews you are screening in this film of now really old people, and you can still feel the trauma. How was it for you to have these conversations? These are very intimate, very severe conversations.
Yeah. No, it's you know, I can still remember it really clearly. It was years ago, and there was and you're right. I mean, this community has suffered. Many Indigenous communities have suffered, you know, from being put onto reserves, very small pieces of land that are usually terrible pieces of land. You know, you can't grow anything there. It's, you know, they would put Indigenous people on the worst places, and the residential schools. And you know, before that as well, the smallpox and the different disease epidemics, which were you know, they hit the West Coast in the late 1800s, and the devastation, we don't know the level, but it's believed to be potentially, you know, 60–80% of people in some places. So, but speaking to the community was really a profound honor. It was a multi-stage process. So it's worth sort of saying a little bit. I know we cover this somewhat in the interview that we did earlier, so people can read more about it. But what happened was the community themselves funded the film. They had felt, and for those who see the film, you'll understand it as you see, but for years, their story had been told through an outside lens, a colonial lens. And they really felt that despite being in newspapers and having a sort of novel loosely based on their community and various representations, anthropological and otherwise, that their story hadn't actually been told from their perspective. So they decided they wanted to make a film. And because they didn't have a filmmaker from that community, I'm not from their community, I'm Anishinaabe, which is from sort of much further east in the country. But they had seen my work on television and reached out to me. So we embarked on a bit of a get to know each other process. I, at the time, was doing community workshops with youth. And so they invited myself and the team I was working with to do a workshop. So I was there for about 2 weeks, I think. And we worked with their youth making films in the language, but it was also, everybody knew in the community that I was going to be a filmmaker that would be working on this film. And so it was kind of an extended meet and greet. People would just drop into the community center where we were working. I was able to look at the archives, and we sort of spent several stages of getting to know each other. We agreed to work together. And when I did the interviews, what was really interesting is that it was actually quite important, I think, to the community, that even though I was an outsider, that it was coming from them. I was not someone who decided, oh, you guys need to have a story about your voice. And, you know, so even though as a creative, as a filmmaker, I was given my freedom to create the film as I saw fit, they were the ones who had requested it. And so the power dynamic was really, I think, important to the quality of those interviews, because they felt it was their film, even though, of course, I was the creative one making the decisions in the edit suite and choosing the questions and everything else. So, you know, what I found was that people opened up remarkably, they were remarkably open. And I think that's due to a couple of things. Number one, what I just said, you know, that it felt like their film. And number two, they're storytellers culturally. So, you know, the potlatch culture, everything about that culture had a huge storytelling component, as many indigenous cultures do. But I think that this notion, and especially the elders, right, who had grown up in really such a different time of ceremony and storytelling and dances in these huge big houses, right, where it's I think that there was part of it that their ability to just speak their, you know, it's not a made up story, it's their history, but was just so compelling. And, you know, for me, the most profound thing was so many of them, I had this camera person who's a friend of mine that I work with a lot. And he would say, you know, at the end of my interviews, I would always say to the sound and camera, do you have any questions for this interviewee? You know, I'm the director, but maybe what you've heard, you'd like to ask them a question. So my camera person would always say the same question, which was, what's the most important thing? And then the interviewee would always say, about like my life, and he's like, nope, no clarification, just what's the most important thing. And, you know, I shot with him a lot on a lot of different films, and he would always ask this question. In this community, I cannot tell you how many people said love. Wow. And despite all the trauma that they went through, and so many of them were weeping in the interviews and really going through difficult times. And at the end, they would say, love is the most important thing. I just love my community. I love my culture. And it was just the most moving, thing. Yeah.
Yeah, you can still feel this spirit while watching the movie. That's very clear. It's a very emotional, very moving film. I have a lot more questions towards agency, storytelling, indigenous film community, but maybe we come back to that a little later with other projects. Because what I would like to do in this talk is, as you mentioned, we made an interview last November, and what might be interesting for our public, that this is right now published on the SCHIRN mag at our magazine, so you can read it in German and in English. So we stop talking about how people live right now and widen the focus a little bit. And before we start talking about your other work, we would like to share 3 very different projects. The first one is Bidaban, First Light, the most recent one from 2018. It's a very special project because it's virtual reality. I'm curious to know more about that. And the second one is Restoration from 2012.
I think that one is actually 2015 or 2016.
Okay. So sorry. And the third one is Savage. So Roman, if you could share these snippets right now, that would be wonderful.
Hahne sa hioton son hiwa atisha I sentiuhqua.
A vision that I had some 20 years ago. It's all real now. I had a vision that perhaps our people may come together and paddle down from our homelands in our great dugout canoes and bring our children to these steps and break a copper. It's a symbol of justice, a symbol of balance. We hold this symbol as sacred. I'd like to explain the history that led us here. Our people have endured near annihilation. We went through shameful dark times. We are not terrorists. We're good people. Our First Nations issues are all of our issues because it reflects on all of Canada.
Baby soto sima Dipuscao bi moi Bi mi hao ki siko Bi mi hao askawa Ni tonang bawata mo win Miso ite o day Bis-moi si so win Ataka apache Bimha babies Bimiha da kiwe Do Darwin Tape kiwe totawe Tape kiwe totawe
I don't know where to start. Amazing. I love this last one, Savage. It's so great. I mean, who were those kids?
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that, or shall?
No, maybe we start seriously, but also, I mean, those kids were really great. A musical in Cree language. That's something. I remember when we talked before, you were saying that this was a little bit of a challenge that was given to you while being part of an international indigenous collective, the Embargo Collective. Maybe you want to share the story about that.
Yeah, so there's a film festival in Toronto. It's the biggest Indigenous film festival in the world. It's called Imaginative, and it's been around for just over 20 years. And over the last 10 years, especially, even a bit more, it became, initially I would say it was more Canadian American, and then it has really grown over the years. And now, there's Sami people from, Northern Europe, there's Maori people, there's, Indigenous people from all over the world. And someone who had worked closely with Imaginative, Dennis Goulet, who actually has her first feature at the Berlinale right now, by the way, called Night Raiders. She had this idea inspired by Lars von Trier's film, The Five Obstructions, where he challenges his mentor to recreate a film of his 5 times with different obstructions or challenges. So inspired by that, she thought it would be interesting to bring together an international group of Indigenous filmmakers. Most of us knew each other already, and we spend 3 days together. We know each other's work, but we watch each other's work and we would discuss. And at the end of this 3 days, everyone in the group would create a challenge for a short film to be made in the next year to premiere at the following year's festival. And so that was the embargo. And in my case, I had never done anything but documentary before. And I was assigned to do a musical with heavy metal music in it, as well as lots of set decoration. And there was a universal obstruction for all the filmmakers, which was we were not allowed to use English in the films. And so it kind of unleashed my creativity, and Savage, the film you saw, is the result of that. And, you know, it's obviously referencing residential schools and children being taken away. My mother attended a residential school from age 5 to 15. So it's a history that is really, you know, present in my family. It's often seen as historical, but I think, you know, in Canada, even in Canada, you know, a lot of times non-Indigenous folks see this, oh, that was some history that happened a long time ago. And it's certainly not. And so, you know, as an Indigenous filmmaker, essentially, I find that in many of my projects, you know, a lot of times things that are Indigenous or deal with this history are seen as, you know, it's good for you, but it's not entertaining, or it's not what you choose to watch, right? It's too challenging. And so I find a lot of my career, I've been making films that try to use aesthetic, you know, formal, stylized ingenuity to kind of get people to learn this history. But I would say that, you know, looking at it again, I feel that one of the things I've often done is I want to express the depth of the pain and the trauma of these experiences, but also the resilience and the humanity, and not reduce people to a stereotype of the victim. And so this is one where, of course, I loved, I'm of an age where when I was young, Michael Jackson's Thriller album came out. And so it was just
this is very obvious.
Yeah, it was such a thrill to incorporate it. And also, you know, especially then, but you know, how in the Black community, hip hop is a form of resistance and revolt almost. And in the same way, it has been adopted in Indigenous communities. There's lots of, maybe a little less now, but especially then, there's lots of rapping about the concerns that we had, you know. And so I felt that there was a really nice echo too with the dance scene to some of the resistance and the kind of artful forms it was taking in Canada.
And that's why my immediate response was, and I think that's very natural to say, these kids are awesome, and that comes over very, very clearly, and they are up to something. They have leverage in a way. Yeah, this is a very good thing. And what I really love about it, what you were saying, that's a very serious topic in an unusual form or even genre. Yeah, so it's really broadening things and brings, I don't want to say a certain lightness, because it's not really light, but it's entertaining, like in a Hollywood sense of Melo in a way, or a little bit to me.
Yeah.
So
and I'll say, you know, one of the things we often talk about is within Indigenous, and I think many communities that have experienced trauma, but certainly in the Indigenous community, there's so much humor, there's so much joking, and oftentimes we will joke about anything, you know, things that seem traumatic or whatever, still joke about it. And I think that's often common when people have been through it. It's a bit of a coping mechanism, but it's also like you cannot be just underneath the weight of the trauma all the time. And so it's also a really lovely way, you're right, it is light, and it's kind of incorporating that in a way that I think for sure when I watch this film with an Indigenous audience, like it's just, people are just roaring with laughter. And it's so nice to feel that joy. And also it is that, you know, even with the trauma, that our spirits are still intact. You know, it wasn't successful. And very often when we see films that just show the difficulties, it sort of feels like we were destroyed, you know, and that's really not something that feels very good when you're still living, and here we are. Yeah. Yeah.
You were mentioning Imaginative and also the first Embargo Collective. If I understood correctly, there was also a second Embargo Collective.
Yeah. So the first embargo was 3 Canadians, 3 Americans, a Maori person who is Taika Waititi, who's now famous in Hollywood, and Aboriginal Australian, and it was male and female, and like I said, we all knew each other. The second one was all Canadian women, and that was an interesting thing. I noticed these embargo collectives were a little prescient, like they kind of came before their time in some respects, because it was a little bit before, at least in Canada and North America, there was a real spotlight put on how the gender balance was so off in filmmaking. And there's been a lot of work towards parity of men and women in key filmmaking roles. But this kind of came a little bit before that. So it felt incredible to do a second round. They took 3 of us Canadian women filmmakers from the first embargo. And then there were 3 upcoming filmmakers, one of whom actually has a work in your exhibition, Caroline Monet. And they were more emerging at that time. Oh, 2 works. Oh yeah, she's genius. Yeah, she's so wonderful. And there was also Alethea Arnacook-Burrill and Elmaya Tailfeathers, Zoe Hopkins and Helen Haig Brown. So of course we all knew each other because it's not that big of a community, but we came together, did a similar 3 days together. And then we put restrictions on each other, but it was all women. And there was an intentional matching of you know, there are still really great filmmakers, but newer filmmakers with more seasoned, older filmmakers. This idea that we help each other along, and the mentorship and the sense of community, I would say, was core to both of the embargoes, because filmmaking can be very competitive, very industry oriented. And this was about lifting up the community. And in this case, what we did, which was really nice, was we all drew each other's names out of a hat. And whoever's name you got, whatever her work was like, you would take inspiration from that into the film that you would make. So when we premiered, I have to tell you, we decided, this is a year later, we all go to the festival, we've made our films, and we decided that we were going to just dress to the nines, like, you know, red carpet styles. And this film festival is not a red carpet festival. But we thought, you know, it's not about us, it's about the fact that we're all women, and we're all women making these films, and we should really celebrate, because I have to tell you that even though in the mainstream film industry, women are much less than 50%, you know, as directors, as key people, in the Indigenous film industry, women are like 80% of the directors. It's so heavily, and people have studied this, academics have asked me so many times, like, why do you think it's so many women? But
yeah,
it's
that would have been my question. How come?
Yeah, well, I have a few answers. I mean, I don't have the answer. I would say, number one, culturally, traditionally in Indigenous communities, women hold a lot of power. There's many matriarchal societies, or there's societies like, let's say, the Mohawk people. They, the men are the warriors and are the leaders, but there's a women's council. And they don't do anything unless they go to these elder women, this council, and they ask permission. So I think that culturally, many of our, like, if you spend time amongst the Haida and Haida Gwaii off on the West Coast, you can just see the power of the women. So I think culturally, compared to, you know, Euro-Western norms, it's less patriarchal. But I also think perhaps it's because if you look at Indigenous communities, it's often, and many Indigenous men will say this, the women are like the ones who are the power holders, and they're doing so many things. And I think it's also because motherhood is really revered, and raising children is so central culturally to most Indigenous communities and nations, that the woman as mother is seen as just the most important job. So I think it translates to a respect. And also that means that women hold a lot of power in community, they organize things, they hold. So I think it's a natural transition into running film sets and things like that.
Speaking of Indigenous societies, that maybe could work as a good bridge to the next project we were showing. Sorry, in a short excerpt, Restoration, a very, very different project from the one we were just talking about. This was mainly just found footage, or wasn't?
Yeah. So Restoration is made entirely of found footage that I got from the internet. And it was a sort of another self-made challenge. So the event that you're seeing there probably could use a little bit of explaining. Yeah. So in Canada in December of 2012, there was a movement that was very large called Idle No More that just sort of took off really through social media. So the initial spark was that there had been a Canadian bill in the government that was going to be passed. And sort of with our government, a lot of times they might have buried in this thick, government document all these changes they want to make to laws. And deep within this thing was changes to be made to how rivers and waterways would be addressed. And it would be really bad environmentally. And at the time we had quite a conservative government in power, and it was a way to kind of give companies, corporations access to these. So that was the initial thing, was this realization that it was going to have a very strong impact on the environment. But it was women-led again, so it's kind of similar to what I was just talking about, that these, I think it was 3 or 4 women came together in the prairies in the middle part of the country, and they coined this term idle no more, like we will not sit back, we will not be quiet. And it just took off on the internet, like Facebook, especially, like wildfire, this idea that we won't stand. And it grew sort of like the Occupy movement in New York. It wasn't like a specific advocacy. It was sort of that Indigenous rights and agency needed to be recognized. So it was kind of, in its aims, it was kind of broader, but it sparked this huge galvanization of the Indigenous community. And what you saw at that time, which was kind of amazing because it was just coming up to Christmas, a round dance is a traditional community gathering where people, like, there's drumming and singing and people just dance in this sort of traditional way that you would see, and it's a big community get together. Well, the Indigenous people, they started saying, let's meet at the mall, in a big shopping mall. There'll be central areas that are quite large. So people would drum, and hundreds of people, Indigenous people, would show up in their regalia and dance in the middle of the shopping mall just before Christmas. And this was happening all over the country. There were marches. So as part of this movement, Idle No More, the person that you saw speaking, and you heard speaking, and you saw, he's passed away not too long after that, but his name is Bo Dick. And he's a Kwakwaka'wakw person from Alert Bay in British Columbia. And he's an incredible artist and carver, and also kind of a ceremonial person and a real leader and a chief. And so on the west coast of Canada, those metal pieces that you saw them breaking and that you saw a photo of someone holding that's called a copper. And in West Coast culture, that's the most valuable, prestigious belonging you could have. I don't know, it'd be the equivalent of a crown or something like that. And to have one of these coppers, like if a chief had several of them, it was really powerful. So it represented kind of financial wealth, but also your standing in the community. And historically on the West Coast, many nations, if they were wronged by another nation, they would break a copper as a shaming. It's a shaming ceremony to say you've done wrong. And if you don't make it right, we're going to come and invade you and go to war or something like that. So it was a really important thing. And with colonization, it had gone away. So what Bo did was a group of Indigenous people walked, I think, several days to the seat of the government in British Columbia, one of our provinces, and broke this copper in front of that crowd that you see. And I thought it was really powerful. I remember watching it on the internet when it was happening and just being so moved that this ancient tradition, this political statement, was being brought back to life and being, really saying to the government in British Columbia, like, you need to repair this relationship. And so I was very moved by it, but I also thought it was, as an artist, very interesting because, of course, everyone I knew that was there was filming it on their cell phone and everything like that. So then choosing to use that footage to create it was also a sign of how social media had been part of Idle No More and really important to our political kind of coming together.
And maybe just one remark to that. The soundtrack also is quite smashing. That's A Tribe Called Red, isn't it?
Yeah, that's A Tribe Called Red. Thank you to A Tribe Called Red because it was a little bit of a DIY. I just made it myself, that film. And I know them a little bit, but I've used it not exactly with permission. So.
Okay, I never mentioned it.
No, I think I'll forgive it. Well, and I will say it's a tribute now to Bo Dick because he passed, I would say, within a year of me making that film. And so it's in honor of him as well and the role that he held in the community. Yeah.
That brings us from recent history to our latest project, a very futuristic one about indigenous futurism, Bidaban, First Light, a VR experience about nature taking over Toronto.
Yeah. So Bidaban, First Light, it came out in 2018, and its genesis was actually, way back around 2005. I was researching to make. So my mother spoke our indigenous language, Anishinaabe before she was taken to the residential school. So the story in Canada really, and in many places like the US, is that the residential school system, which was so damaging, ran in Canada from the late 1800s until actually the last school didn't close until the 1990s, but it really was powerful right up until the 1950s and 60s. And then they started to close a little bit, but very, very powerful over like several generations. And many people, the languages were forbidden to be spoken in those schools, and children were, and this comes up in how people live as well, children were physically punished and brutally often for speaking their language. So many children went into the schools speaking their language, sometimes only their indigenous language. And by the time they came out, they did not have their indigenous language at all, not just because they weren't allowed to speak it, but because they were punished, that there was a trauma for speaking the language. So this was really deep, and it's very profound because it's left many, there's approximately 50 native languages in Canada, more than that actually, and only 3 of them are safe from being on the edge of not being spoken. So it's really important that we protect these languages. So I had been thinking about how to do a film about language, and this was in 2005, and I was going to make a conventional documentary, just a straightforward, let's talk about how valuable these languages are, because I started looking into the linguistics of the languages, and my mind was blown. The way that they function is so profoundly different, and it made me see that all the values and all the concepts and all this, when we think that Indigenous people are more environmental, or there's a sense of relatedness to nature, all of that is in the languages. It's the way, and if you really look into them, you see the way our language shapes the way we relate to things. So I became really fascinated by this, but I started to see that even a conventional documentary wasn't the correct form to talk about these ideas, because it was so experiential. It was so much about getting out of your head and into a living experience of being in the world, an embodied experience, really. And so I put it aside, and then many years later, I decided that the right form would be an installation. So I did make an installation called Transmissions, so that you could physically move through it, and that felt really in keeping with the deeper ideas of the language. But then I realized there could be another project that would be very similar, and making use of this new technology, virtual reality, where you can put on a headset. And I find, I don't know how many people have done virtual reality. I'm not particularly technical. You wouldn't know it from my projects because they're often very technical. But me, myself, I'm not. I'm not wowed by the latest thing. I it doesn't really matter to me. But I realized, because there's something called room scale VR, which allows you to move around with the headset on and feel like you're in a space. And I realized, what if we took the middle of Toronto, right downtown, because that spot that you see in that video, and in the experience, is right over here is City Hall. Right over there is the biggest shopping mall. Right over there is the courthouse. It's like the middle of, the colonial powers. So, and it's a place where all the tourists go, it's called Nathan Phillips Square. And it's kind of the biggest public square. What if we took that over and we imagined a future where the plants have taken over, where the animals have taken over? And what's more, the languages are back. Those traditional languages of that territory, which is Mohawk, Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe and Wendat. And so I created an 8-minute experience where you can move through, and you start off, as you see, in a subway tunnel, and then you move to the ground floor, like just outside on the ground. And you see this woman digging, and you end up on this top of a skyscraper where there's this dome and there's corn growing. It feels sort of ceremonial. And you actually, at one point, which isn't in the trailer, you are transported inside the dome, and then the dome just evaporates, and you're in the sky with the stars.
Wow.
And all the way through, you're hearing in different points language, right? Mm-hmm. And then at the end, you're back on that sky or the rooftop again, but now it's the first light of dawn. Mm-hmm. And I'll just explain to you that, so Bedabin is Anishinaabe Moen or Ojibwe, and it means dawn, but it actually means the very first light of dawn, like just before dawn really breaks. And it was explained to me that the 3 parts of the word, bi, da, ban, actually mean, one of them means here or now. It's sort of the same thing. Now and here mean the same thing in the language. And then it means something that's past and is in the past, like passed away, but it also means the future coming at you really quickly. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, when the past and the future collide, you get the present moment. Oh, wow. And so it really resonates with this idea that this is an apocalyptic future, but it's informed by the past. And what if these languages that we hear, and we see these kind of glowing dust motes, and so the language is a bit disembodied. So my conjecture was, what if these languages that, in a way, we could think of the languages as speaking the land through us as humans, right? That those languages describe that land better than any other language on the world, because the languages emerged out of that land and we as humans speak it. So it was a way to sort of connect language to landscape, or land, let's say. Anyway, so I'll stop there, but that was the intention, and it's very embodied. When people go through the experience, they're not in their heads, they're really, and that was the value of virtual reality for that project.
It really sounds like an alternate reality. I would love to have this experience. Is it still traveling?
Yeah, I can put you in touch. We could see about it. Yeah.
That would be great. We had a very interesting hour behind us. Maybe this is a very good point to stop, because we still have an interesting hour before us, because for everyone who is here in our Zoom talk, once we stop now, and I thank you so much, Lisa. It was so interesting, all your insights you were giving, and especially I think our German visitors learned a lot about Canada and Indigenous cultures, which they haven't known before, and they learned a lot about your very incredible work you were doing over the years in all these different and rich facets. Thank you so much for that. And we now are able to watch how people live via Zoom For those who joined us through YouTube or Facebook, you can also be part of that by visiting our homepage, the SCHIRN homepage, where you will be able to also screen this film. I highly recommend that. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and have a great evening. Good night, and hello to Canada again.
Yeah,
Bye bye.
Bye,
Bye everyone.
Bye.